But they gave you a story that was compelling that you wanted to read. And by reading it, you wanted probably to listen to the album now because you were inspired by that story. And that's a great example, because what we want to do is we want to take the thing that people don't care about and attach it to something that they will.
You are now listening to the Creative Juice podcast, brought to you by IndiePRO.io.
What's up, Indies? Welcome back to the Creative Juice podcast. We're excited to be back with you today. This is episode 323. I'm your host, Jack McCarthy. And if you've been struggling with commanding attention online, on social media, I think you're going to like this episode today. With me, as always, is Circa. Cirque, what's up, dude?
Not a whole lot, dude. Just very excited to pod.
Me too, man. I think this will be a fun episode because it's been a while since you and I have talked about attention and copywriting. And that's the purpose of this episode, because we're going to be talking about what artists can learn from tabloids and gossip. Didn't have that on my 2024 bingo card, but I think that this is going to be a fun one.
Yeah, and it's definitely well-worn territory in the digital marketing side of things. Digital marketing proper, it's kind of, if you're learning digital marketing, you're going to be introduced to the idea that actually tabloids are goated when it comes to getting attention. And a lot of early intro to digital marketing stuff talks about drawing your copywriting inferences from those kinds of headlines. So
definitely, for sure. And it's interesting, like we mentioned at kind of the start of this episode, I think this is what artists and creative types of all kinds struggle with the most when it comes to engaging with a fan base and building an audience online, is commanding attention in a way that actually does that. And you see this played out most often when you see, big things coming soon type posts and out now type posts around releases and around just whatever the artist is doing to try and engage their fans online. You actually have a really great video about this where you talk about newsworthiness and what makes something newsworthy. Maybe that's an interesting jumping off point to go into before we kind of break down the exercise here.
Yeah, just to rehash that video, which we'll include in the show notes, it's a video on our YouTube channel. But there's certain elements of newsworthiness that copywriters rely on to try to bake these elements into their copy, especially when it comes to a headline. For your context, if you're a musician listening to this, your headlines are going to exist in social media posts, email subject lines, or the first line in an email, at the top of landing pages, those kinds of places. And in press releases, of course, but we tend to use those a little bit less. So those elements are relevance, timeliness, simplification, predictability, unexpectedness, continuity, composition, elite people, elite countries, and negativity. There's a shorter list that was provided earlier in sort of the in the lexicon, which is timeliness, proximity, importance, impact, or consequence, interest, conflict or controversy, sensationalism, prominence, and then novelty, oddity, or the unusual. Just to unpack those a little bit, timeliness, means how proximal is like your instance of reading this headline to what the headline is about. So did this happen very recently, or is this about to happen in the very near future? Proximity is like physical location proximity. Is what's going on in this headline happening in your neighborhood or in your city or in your state? That can make it more newsworthy. Importance, impact, or consequence is about, how many people will the event impact? So issues like climate change are easy news topics because it impacts everybody. Interest involves like special human interests, right? So is it an inspirational story of a person overcoming odds to reach their goals? That's a fundamental human interest. Conflict or controversy is just what it states, right? It's something controversial or a conflict occurring between two or more parties that can be newsworthy. Sensationalism is also self-explanatory, right? It's like it is taking an element of the truth and bringing it to like its most sensational end, or invoking, particular interests that are delicate and easy to arouse, excitement about or anger or whatever. Prominence is like has to do with like elite people or public figures or elite places, geographic locations. And then novelty, oddity, or the unusual is just strangeness, right? Is this strange? Dog bites man, no story. Man bites dog, story.
Yeah, that's a good one. Remember when probably back maybe 8-9 years ago, the bath salts stories of people eating other people's faces?
Eating other people's faces and taking bath salts. And it's funny because that was a great example of sensationalism, because to not get too complex into the story, the drugs that were being taken by the face eaters, they were called analogs, meaning they were already illegal substances that were slightly chemically changed to not be the exact substance that's illegal. But under the Analogs Act, all of the substances that are very similar to the illegal substances are illegal for human consumption, is what it says. So instead, they sell them as bath salts because it's not human consumption. You're just using it as bath salts, or they sell it as plant food. And they could have described that, but instead they just said new drug called bath salts, right?
Man eats face.
Yeah, exactly. So you
Yeah.
could have reduced the sensationalism by being accurate, but instead they chose the more sensational route.
You know, it's interesting. You picked up on interest as being a newsworthy element, and something you see a lot on the internet. And I think artists can learn from this. Before we get into tabloids, even, this is almost like your neighborhood level tabloid. Is you ever go on Reddit and look at the "Am I the asshole" posts? Am I the asshole for kicking out my 17-year-old for kicking our dog down the stairs? Like, those kinds of things always grab my attention. And that's the family related interest. Like, is this interesting in how it might impact my family if something like this were to happen?
Yeah.
Super, super good. I love the breakdown of those, Cirque. I think that that's really helpful. And it kind of points out, I think, what we often see artists struggle with, because like an out now post really doesn't hit any of those things. You know, when I was thinking about bringing this topic to the podcast, and as you and I were talking about it, it actually came to my attention last Friday when I was grocery shopping. I was running through the grocery store, and I have a simple exercise that I sometimes do just for fun to kind of kickstart creativity in my brain. And that's to stroll the magazine aisle and look at magazine covers and tabloids and look at the headlines on the covers of these magazines. And I think this is something really easy that any artist, musician can do to start kind of tilting the direction of their thinking when it comes to social media content, and specifically like how you gather attention, by doing something like this. Or, you know, you can do it online too. You can look at tabloid websites, or you can look at BuzzFeed. These are all good places to pay attention to how writing is done and done well, how copywriting is done and done well. And so I wanted to unpack some examples and how they might apply to what you might be doing online for engaging your fan base.
Yeah. And just to sort of set the template for a process or a habit you can use to incorporate these elements into every time you got to write a bit of text to promote anything having to do with your music, is you can memorize the elements of newsworthiness I listed, even just by their short name: timeliness, proximity, importance, interest, conflict, sensationalism, prominence, novelty. Write it down on your phone if you have to in a little note. And then when you go to look at tabloids, try to identify what elements are being hit in the headline. And then you'll develop sort of an affinity for recognizing that, and then and some good sensibilities about how you can bake it in when you're writing.
For sure. And I think you'll also start to naturally find the ones that you're inclined to use, which is cool. Like, that sort of naturally helps you find what you might feel like fits in with your brand, or who you are as an artist, and what feels comfortable and what doesn't. And then you can kind of expand those comfort levels from there. Cause I don't think you should just say like, well, I don't want to talk like that. No, throw that out the window. You should try them all.
And I mean, there's some elements that are going to be more or less relevant to the case of, you know, let's say you're announcing that a new single's coming out on social media. Like, some of these elements are just sort of excluded from the set that are relevant to that activity. So, you know, it's totally okay to say like, yeah, I generally don't need to use these in this context, but you should converge across like a few elements that are just always usable.
For sure. For sure. I mean, just to give some examples of some of the things that you see as very common on tabloids, and not even tabloids, regular magazines as well. I delineate between regular magazines and tabloids, tabloids being like ultra sensational typically versus regular magazines, which also typically have great headline copy. But you'll see things like the shocking truth, did you know that? There's a lot of usage of those kinds of phrases. That kind of phraseology comes out. Third person often comes out because, Jim Carrey isn't writing about Jim Carrey on the cover of People magazine.
Yeah, and I mean, shocking truth revealed hits on a number of different elements. You might even classify it as its own element, which is like revelation, right? Like something that was previously hidden has been made obvious or has been revealed, but it's also timely, right? This was previously thought to be true, was just found out to be actually untrue or is different. So yeah, you'll find some of these like baked in novel ways.
For sure, yeah. And this is something interesting, Sirk. You brought this up before we were rolling camera, and I definitely don't want to miss out on this. Is I think something that a lot of artists struggle with is, what tense am I writing in? Am I saying I or we, or using our band name? And I wanted to give some examples from the agency, just kind of speaking candidly here. For a lot of artists that have a high degree of name recognition, when we're going after selling for them, we actually have found that third person copywriting, much like you would see in, newspaper or tabloid headlines, works really, really well for the purposes of driving conversions. And again, a lot of that has to do with name recognition and the fact that fans aren't necessarily expecting first person on social media all the time. Now, do you need to find a healthy balance between the two? I think you do. But you don't have to get too hung up on this idea. And I'm saying that from experience and results. It's not something that I'm just anecdotally mentioning to you because magazines do it. This is actually reality.
Yeah, I think that as we went over in the beginning of before the episode started, we were just talking in the lobby, and I think you can find ways to use either, and it all just depends on your personal comfort level and what methods you've engineered, like at this point in your process of getting better at this, to address each one, right? It's easier to ignore a headline that's first person, I think, naturally, because it's easier to ignore, or it's easier to take as truth or as something that's important when you're talking about someone else because you have no bias, right? So it's hard to talk in first person and have it still be captivating. But there are certainly ways. And I think it really relies on, it won't matter that you're talking in first person if you are hitting some critical elements of newsworthiness. You are making it exciting.
For sure, yeah. I found it an interesting, really great example of a band that could have used like out now type copy around their album drop on social media, and they didn't. And the post absolutely caught my attention. It wasn't even an ad, it was something served up to me on Instagram in the Reels feed. And their headline for their copy was, "We turned down a major label deal to do this." Now, obviously, like, I am attuned to paying attention to that kind of information or that kind of language on the internet. Like, that's a dog whistle a little bit to me. But imagine if they had led with, "Our new album is out now." And then the next line was, "We turned down a major label deal to do this." I never would have looked. And it was such a good, and it was a great video ad too. It was telling a whole story of this major label negotiation that they had gone through for like a year and a half trying to get signed, and the deal that was offered to them, and how the label wanted all the rights to the record forever. And it was so good. I wish I remember the band's name.
Such a good example, right? Where like, okay, we have to talk about this album being out now. We have to get people excited for it. So attaching that to the story that they did makes it so much more interesting. And after reading that, because you might not want to listen to the album if they just said this album is out now.
I certainly wouldn't. I had no idea who they were.
But they gave you a story that was compelling that you wanted to read. And by reading it, you wanted probably to listen to the album now because you were inspired by that story. And that's a great example, because what we want to do is we want to take the thing that people don't care about and attach it to something that they will.
Right. Exactly. So I want to give some examples from tabloids that I think would be fun, and we can kind of talk through why they're interesting and how some of them might be easily reframed into something that an artist could use. This was one from The Independent that I thought was really good. I was looking around on Sunday after my little grocery store trip. I was like, oh, I wonder like what can I find on the internet? What can't I find on the internet is probably the better question. But this was a headline from The Independent, and it was, "We love to hate Katie Price." And I was like, man, that's attention grabbing.
Conflict.
Yeah.
Conflict and controversy.
Right. Conflict.
Sensationalism.
Yeah, exactly. It hits all those beats. And imagine reframing that for your single release, your music video. You could say something like, "Another song from the band everyone loves to hate." You're not naming yourself. You're not speaking in first person, but you're also not speaking in third person. And I think that could be a really simple way to reframe those kinds of headlines.
Yeah. A great example is, and I always bring them up, they're my favorite marketing example because they're just so good at it. But Insane Clown Posse frequently refers to themselves as the world's most hated band. That's not an example of something that's used in a headline, but it certainly could be, right? It's no longer novel to their fans. But yeah.
Yes, I love that. I didn't know that. I'm not an ICP follower, so I did not know that. That's really cool.
I have become an ICP studier.
A juggalo?
No,
a juggalo librarian.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
I'm an Insane Clown Posse anthropologist.
That's super good. Some other headlines that I think are, noteworthy here from The Inquirer. The Inquirer is a tabloid magazine. Netflix edited out Kim Kardashian getting booed at roast. That's an interesting one.
So conflict or controversy, because she's getting booed.
Celebrity.
Prominence, Kim Kardashian. Timeliness, this just happened.
It was Tom Brady's roast, I think.
Okay, yeah. So it literally just happened.
Yep.
I want to say that Netflix editing it out, it adds this element of like they're trying to hide this from you.
Right.
Which I'm not quite sure where that fits in the list of elements, but it's something to keep in mind, right?
Yeah.
Because that's frequently used as like, shocking truth revealed, something hidden it's revelation, right?
Yep, exactly. Another interesting one is, I love this one actually. This totally caught my attention, was "Fight back against crooks and win." I was like, what is this? And I clicked it, and the sub headline was "Top Cop's new video series reveals how to protect your family." Imagine that on a social media ad or post. Fight back against crooks and win.
So conflict or controversy, importance, impact, or consequence, because, right, it's important. It's your family you're protecting. It's not getting scammed by crooks. So I think it hits on both of those. I would say that it's a bit sensational, right? But yeah.
Yep. 100%. What's interesting about that one and why I wanted to mention it is this is an example of a type of headline where you could interpolate this style into promoting a music video, a performance video, and pull from the lyrics or the content of the video itself, what's going on in it, as opposed to talking about your band or your artist name or yourself in first person or third person. It's commentary on what's actually going on in the content. So it's connecting, the video or the image to the post. I think you can do this in so many different ways.
I think one example of this is like any time that your song or what you're talking about involves a true story. That true story is a prime candidate for being the thing you're attaching your announcement to or what you're trying to communicate to. You start with the true story and take out what's newsworthy about that true story. And then you attach your song if it's about that true story, or, your release campaign if it involves that true story. An example might be, let's say that you're running a crowdfunding campaign for an album and something remarkable happened with one of the donors, right? Where they were overly generous or they communicated a personal story to you that was, heartfelt or touching. Like that story is the lead, right? And then the thing you're attaching it to is like this campaign and I mean, don't be exploitative, but certainly true stories are prime candidates, and highlighting people above your own needs is always a good thing.
100%. And this kind of goes into another direction that I wasn't planning on even talking about, but like when you have messages with your fans, man, it's such a good place to pull those kinds of stories from. When you're talking to your fans or if they're commenting on things. Something I regularly do actually in email copy is, for example, if I'm sending out a nurturing email for content that an artist just released, free content, and I'm giving it to the email list to keep them in the loop and engage them, I might pull comments from other fans from the YouTube video, for example, and bring that into the email body copy and be like, look what Jim had to say about this crazy character, or look what Jim had to say about this song. And usually I pull like the funniest comments or things that would catch people's attention or incite some kind of emotion, good or bad. Sometimes you can even bring up like hater comments and bring them into the fold. I've seen actually, there's been a few artists around over time that have done the like, I made a song.
There was that artist, like TikTok person, who made a song entirely out of their hate comments.
Exactly. Yep. Exactly. Same kind of deal.
I had a fan reach out back when I was a solo artist before I had my group and say like, hey, I heard this song Sacrifice a year or two ago, and I just wanted to tell you that like I'm clean and sober now, and the song really helped me in my journey because it definitely has like themes of addiction and sort of living a bad life. And I wouldn't want to call out that person specifically, but I would want to share their story if I were talking about this song or introducing it. And it really might be that I don't have any reason to talk to, like, the song's not out now. It was out years ago, right? So I don't really have any reason to say out now, but I do have this story. So it's a great opportunity to re-highlight the song through the lens of how the song impacted a fan. So I could tell that story and call attention back to the song, because if you read that story, you want to hear the song that helped that person, right?
Here's a great headline that you could use if you were, let's say you were repurposing content from that song, a music video, right? You could say, when I wrote this song, I never expected to hear stories like this. I never expected so many of you to reach out to me about whatever.
Or I didn't expect this song to get someone off drugs. Or I didn't expect this song to help someone get clean.
Yeah.
Or whatever.
Yeah.
But I like your idea of sort of bearing the lead a little bit on what the story specifically is about, right? If I tell you up front that that this song helps someone get off drugs, you might think like, okay, I know all I need to know. Song help person get off drugs, right? but if I kind of tease that, right? Like the amazing recovery story of a fan and how my song helped them, or something like that. I'm saying that there is a story, it involves recovery, but I'm not telling you specifically what happened.
Right, exactly. And I think that starts to get into like the philosophy of copywriting and who you're writing to. If you're writing to existing fans, you might not bury the lead at all because you don't need to. If you're writing to top of funnel, never heard of you, trying to break a new audience type of fans, then to get that intrigue, maybe you need to bury the lead a little bit and drive just a bit more curiosity to get them to pay attention.
I'm glad you said that, because it's completely necessary to helping you listening to this episode, walk away with a framework that you can use all the time. You definitely want to consider that, right? Because when you're in a modality of talking to people who might not know who you are, you have to assume that they are always looking, as they read what you wrote, at every word, they are looking for a reason to keep scrolling. They're looking for a reason to ignore it. And so you have to sort of walk this tightrope of stringing them along to the next word and the next sentence, every single word. So if you're writing to fans, you don't have to walk as tight a rope. You still want to captivate them and keep their attention, but it's like they're not exactly looking for every reason to ignore your message.
You hope. Yeah.
Yeah.
Super true. I'm glad you mentioned that as well. I think it's really, really important. The last example that I want to give here before we let you guys go and hopefully see some amazing copy, both inside the IndiePRO community and for anyone listening who's not in the IndiePRO community, go write some amazing copy and then come join our community and share it with us. But I thought this was a really good one. This was actually from the Inquirer. It was an older headline from a few years ago, but I loved it. It was Ellen is at the end of her rope. And it was when Ellen's controversy around her TV show getting canceled was going on and stuff like that. And I was like, okay, how could something like this be applied to artists? And I was like, okay, not that I would recommend ever that you wipe your social media clean when you're getting ready for a release. an album drop or a single or whatever, but I know a lot of artists do that. So I'm using that as an example here. Imagine if you were to wipe your social media clean and the first thing you posted was a video or a graphic, and the copy in the post text or at the, beginning of the video or on the graphic itself was, I am at the end of my rope. Do you think that that would capture the attention of your fans more than just like a tomorrow new single?
Or what's a sensational thing that you might do if you're at the end of your rope?
Yeah.
You can say, I'm about ready to blah, blah, blah.
Yeah. Yep.
Or I'm on the verge of like quitting music forever. Or I'm on the verge of like changing my name and identity, right? Like these are all things like they open a loop, and open loops are a huge part of this practice to know about. Is that like in an instance where you got to walk that tightrope and keep their attention, open loops help you out so much, which is you start a narrative, but you don't give the information necessary to resolve that narrative. So if you say, I am on the verge of X, we still need to know why you're on the verge of X, whether or not you're going to do X, right? These are all open questions that remain after reading that. And what we don't like to do is leave unresolved narratives. So if you can get me to just read that opening of the loop, I will probably read until that narrative is resolved.
Right. Exactly. Here's an interesting copy adaptation or swiping tip that I think is useful, especially if you're thinking about this for the first time. And some of the things that Cirque and I have been saying here today are new. Is Ellen's at the end of her rope, right? How many times can you think of that you've heard copy similar to that? I can think of quite a few. Britney is at the end of her rope. Definitely heard things like that about Britney Spears before. Eminem is at the end of his rope. Like, you can start to replace names into some of these sensational or newsworthy type headlines. And when you can start to do that and think that way, you can then start to take it the next level and be like, well, how could I fit into this? How could I use this for me? How could we use this for us if you're in a band?
Yeah.
Dude, this was fun. Every time we get to talk about copy, it's just like the best podcast episode ever for me.
Yeah. I think and hope that we also made this one really actionable. Like hopefully you can take from this, and I'll list it for you. You can take from this the elements of newsworthiness. You can take from this the habit of checking headlines, email subject lines, social media posts for these elements so that you know better how to write them yourself. You can know the difference between talking to non-fans versus fans and how you got to write differently. And you can know about open narrative loops and how you can use that to, in the context of someone who's not necessarily a fan yet, keep them reading.
100%. I hope you guys dug this. Go write some great copy. We'll catch you next time on Creative Juice. Peace.
Can y'all really feel the East Coast, feel the West Coast?